I'm Dr. Leslie Blankenship-Williams, and in this lecture we are going to expand our understanding of the endocrine system by exploring the super important hypothalamus-pituitary axis, or hypothalamic pituitary unit. It is so incredibly important to the overall endocrine function that we sometimes call it the master gland, as in it is the master of all the other glands. So it all starts with the hypothalamus, which is actually a structure in the brain. If you have taken anatomy or even psychology, you may have learned about the hypothalamus and some of its functions, including that it is part of the limbic system and plays roles in emotion, learning, memory, sexual drive, thirst, hunger, etc. But for our purposes, we're going to focus on its incredibly important role in starting a lot of endocrine processes. In fact, the hypothalamus can be thought of as a link between the central nervous system and the endocrine system. So when we think about the central nervous system controlling the endocrine system, the hypothalamus is almost certainly going to be involved. So the hypothalamus is going to play puppet master to two structures underneath it. Collectively, they are known as the pituitary gland. Now, the pituitary gland is actually broken up into two parts. And we really shouldn't consider them as one unit because those two parts are very, very different. The anterior pituitary gland, which means the pituitary gland towards the anterior side of your body or the front of your body, is a true endocrine gland. And what I mean by that is a collection of cells that basically does nothing but make and secrete hormones. The posterior pituitary gland is neural. And by that, I mean that there's actually neurons in there. And so the posterior pituitary gland is really almost an extension of the brain, where the anterior pituitary gland is almost an out-of-place collection of just generic endocrine cells that lives with the posterior pituitary gland, even though anatomically they are nothing alike. Now, what's really interesting is that the hypothalamus controls both of them. Controls both the anterior and the posterior pituitary gland, but it does it in very different ways. So we are going to start our story by drawing out the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus, and then taking a look first at the posterior pituitary gland. So let's do that now. If you have some different colored pens or pencils, this is an excellent time to put them to use. You'll want to use at least half a page to draw this. I'm first drawing the anterior pituitary gland, and now I'm going to go ahead and draw the posterior pituitary gland. So I'm going to go ahead and label the hypothalamus, the anterior and posterior pituitary gland, and then I'm going to color in the posterior pituitary gland with some broad brush strokes coming down to mimic the fact that this is actually nervous tissue. So these are like axons coming down. And then I'll go ahead and draw in an actual neuron to show you how the neuron is organized between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary gland. So you can see that the axon extends down the stalk to the posterior pituitary gland where it ends in an axon terminal. Now the dendrites in the cell body of that neuron are located up in the hypothalamus. And since the dendrites are going to be where the graded potentials end up controlling whether or not an action potential is generated, I'm going to go ahead and draw some other neuron synapse to those dendrites as shown here. Down at my axon terminal, I'm going to draw a vesicle containing a chemical, but instead of a neurotransmitter, it's going to be a neurohormone. Since the neurohormone will eventually be secreted into the bloodstream, let's go ahead and add a capillary network next to that axon terminal. I'll throw some red blood cells in there for good measure. And now let's come back up here to the neuron dendrites. The dendrites are synapses to presynaptic neurons that are going to be excitatory in nature, so that when the excitatory neurons have action potentials coming down their axons to the axon terminals, they create a graded potential in the cell body of that hypothalamic neuron. And as long as that graded potential exceeds minus 55 millivolts, that's going to trigger a series of action potentials coming down the axon, going all the way to that axon terminal. Now let's take a closer look. What that's going to do is cause secretion of whatever's in that vesicle. And in this case, it's going to be neurohormone. So neurohormone is going to be secreted into the bloodstream, and from there it will be distributed throughout the body. So to summarize, the posterior pituitary gland is really an extension of neural tissue, and so the axons and axon terminals are contained in the posterior pituitary gland, whereas the cell bodies and the dendrites of those neurons are located up in the hypothalamus. So other neurons are going to synapse with those cell bodies and control the secretion of neurohormones from the posterior pituitary gland into the bloodstream. Now, there are only two hormones secreted from the posterior pituitary gland. They are antidiuretic hormone, also known as vasopressin, and oxytocin. So those are the only two hormones secreted from the posterior pituitary gland, and they are both neurohormones because they are being secreted from a neuron. So the control of the hypothalamus over the posterior pituitary gland is very intimate, because in many ways you can almost think of that posterior pituitary gland as an extension of the hypothalamus. You're just basically stretching it out into this pouch in the sphenoid bone. The hypothalamus control over the anterior pituitary gland is done in a much different way. So let's take a look at that. The hypothalamus also contains neurons, but these neurons are located exclusively and entirely within the hypothalamus. Their axon terminals contain neurohormone. And so we've actually got a couple different neurohormones in here, and I've got them in different colors, pink and purple. Those neurohormones are going to be secreted into some capillaries that are running through the hypothalamus. Now these capillaries are special because these capillaries funnel together into a venous system that runs directly into the anterior pituitary gland, where it then splits into another set of capillaries. So this is actually a portal system here, where we go from capillary to vein back to capillary system before then coming down and eventually going to the rest of the body. So in the anterior pituitary gland, I'm going to go ahead and draw actual endocrine cells. Remember, this is a true endocrine organ or endocrine gland. These cells do nothing but make hormones. And I'm going to use a couple different colors here for the hormones that are being contained in the vesicles, because there are actually 6 different hormones that are secreted by the anterior pituitary gland. So let's go ahead and finish drawing this in. Let's pan back out and take a look at the hypothalamus again. Let's focus on those neurons, which contain neurohormones. When those get secreted, where are they going to go? Well, they're going to go into the capillary bed, which is then going to travel down through the stalk into a vein. And then from there, it's going to go into another capillary bed in the anterior pituitary gland. So that portal system will bring hormones directly from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary gland. So let's see that in action. We're going to start with the top neuron that's got the purple neurotransmitter in it. And of course, in order to secrete that neurotransmitter, we're going to need some graded potentials that will lead to action potentials going down the axon to the axon terminal, and then that will trigger exocytosis of whatever's in that vesicle. In this case, it's going to be a neurohormone. Well, that neurohormone is now going to travel through the portal system, so through that specialized vein, to the anterior pituitary gland. So what are those purple neurohormones going to do? Once they get down into the anterior pituitary gland, they're going to bind to receptors on the endocrine cells in the anterior pituitary gland and control secretion of a hormone from an endocrine cell. In my example here, I'm letting the purple neurohormone secreted from the hypothalamus trigger the secretion of a dark green hormone from specified endocrine cells located in the anterior pituitary gland. So the purple neurohormone is controlling whether or not the green hormone is secreted out of the anterior pituitary gland. In this way, that purple hormone is a tropic hormone, meaning it controls the secretion of another hormone. I'm going to quickly show you the secretion of the dark green hormone into the capillary system. Most of the endocrine cells containing that dark green hormone are going to be triggered by the purple neurohormone, but you'll notice that cells that contain a different colored hormone are left alone. So if they contain a dark blue hormone, a light green hormone, or a black hormone, they're not secreting their hormones. Only the dark green ones are being secreted. And that is because the purple hormone is tropic only for the dark green ones. You might notice that by triggering the secretion of the dark green hormone, that more dark green hormone enters the bloodstream than the purple hormone. In other words, it's amplified. We had a minuscule amount of purple hormone being secreted by the hypothalamus, and then when it reaches the anterior pituitary gland, that triggers more dark green hormone. So the amount of dark green hormone is amplified over the purple tropic hormone controlling it. That's going to be a theme we'll see again when we get into the cortisol lecture. As we pan out, we can put everything together and see how the hypothalamus controls the anterior pituitary gland and how that's different than the way the hypothalamus directly controls the posterior pituitary gland. Now let's go back and summarize the anterior pituitary gland. So to summarize, the anterior pituitary gland is controlled by the hypothalamus through the secretion of tropic hormones. So remember, a tropic hormone is going to be any hormone that directly controls the secretion of another hormone. And these are connected by a portal system. So tropic hormones are secreted from the hypothalamus. They move down into the capillary bed in the anterior pituitary gland, and then they trigger the secretion or control the secretion of another hormone from the anterior pituitary gland, which then goes into the bloodstream and has other effects in the body. So it's a little easier if we actually draw out some of the different hormones that are involved so we can really get a good handle on the trend. So I tell you that hypothalamic hormones are going to be tropic hormones, and then they come down into the anterior pituitary gland and control the secretion of hormones there. But let's actually take a look at some examples of real hormones rather than just green dots so that we can see the trend. For my class, I'm going to go ahead and give you a variety of examples here. If it is bolded, it is something that you are responsible for knowing. If it is not bolded, I'm just using it as an example. Do not write it down. It will not be on my test. So let's go ahead and start. We're going to start with one you have to know. The hypothalamus is going to secrete a hormone called corticotropin releasing hormone. And just like immunology, we like to use abbreviations for hormones. So corticotropin releasing hormone gets an abbreviation CRH. Corticotropin releasing hormone is going to travel down, very small amount by the way, is going to travel down into the anterior pituitary gland, where it is going to bind to extracellular receptors on some of those cells, not all of those cells, but some of those cells, and only the cells that are going to be containing corticotropin. So when it binds to those cells, it triggers the exocytosis of those vesicles, causing corticotropin to be secreted from the anterior pituitary gland. And so more corticotropin is secreted than corticotropin releasing hormone. In other words, it is amplified at this step. So what does corticotropin do? Well, notice the word tropin is in there, suggesting once again that it might be a tropic hormone. And in fact, while all hormones secreted from the hypothalamus are indeed tropic hormones, many of the hormones secreted from the anterior pituitary gland are also tropic hormones, which is really fascinating that we get this multi-step pathway. It's not 1, 2, it's 1, 2, 3 steps. So corticotropin is actually going to go out into the bloodstream, where it's going to trigger the adrenal glands to secrete cortisol. So this is actually a 3-step pathway. To get cortisol out into the blood, it starts with the hypothalamus secreting a minuscule amount of corticotropin releasing hormone. CRH comes down into the anterior pituitary gland, triggers secretion of corticotropin, which then goes out into the bloodstream and eventually finds its way to the adrenal cortex, where you secrete cortisol. So let's take a look at another example. This one you also have to know because it's going to come up in reproductive endocrinology. So the hypothalamus secretes gonadotropin releasing hormone, which gets abbreviated GnRH. Gonadotropin releasing hormone comes down the portal system and triggers the anterior pituitary gland cells to actually secrete 2 different hormones, and those are going to be luteinizing hormone, LH, and follicle stimulating hormone, FSH. Now both of those hormones come down to the reproductive system and act on the gonads. They act on both testes and ovaries, but we focus mostly on the ovaries, so they are going to stimulate the development and maturation of follicles and eventually ovulation. That's going to be discussed in a subsequent lecture, but I thought I'd introduce it here. All right, let's take a look at an example that you do not need to memorize. Again, I'm only showing this to you so you can see the themes, so don't write this down in your notes if you're in my class. But this is kind of an important one that you might encounter in your career. And this one is thyrotropin releasing hormone secreted by the hypothalamus. Comes down to the anterior pituitary gland, which secretes thyroid stimulating hormone, so TSH. Some of you, if you have hypothyroidism, might recognize that hormone. And thyroid stimulating hormone is going to do what? It itself is a tropic hormone that's going to come down to your thyroid gland and trigger the secretion of thyroid hormones, T3 and T4. Another example, growth hormone releasing hormone, secreted from the hypothalamus, comes down to the anterior pituitary gland and causes it to secrete, you'll never guess, I bet you will, growth hormone. Awesome. Okay, growth hormone has a myriad of effects throughout the body. I'm not going to go through them. The reason I actually even bring up growth hormone at all is because I wanted to point out that not all tropic hormones are going to trigger the secretion of another hormone. Some tropic hormones are inhibiting. So it turns out that while there is a growth hormone releasing hormone, there is also a growth hormone inhibiting hormone, and it goes by another name, somatostatin. Don't worry about that, but growth hormone inhibiting hormone, if it's secreted from the hypothalamus, is going to do what to the anterior pituitary gland? It's going to tell it to stop secreting growth hormone. So just because something is a tropic hormone doesn't mean that it automatically triggers the secretion of another hormone. It just means that it helps control the secretion of another hormone. But stopping the secretion of a hormone is a type of control. Okay, you can find pictures like this in your textbook that kind of diagram out all of these. You'll see the multiple layers of effects here. So just briefly, I wanted to show you, here's the hypothalamus, here's the anterior pituitary gland. There are actually 6 different hormones secreted by the anterior pituitary gland. We covered 5 of them. The only one we didn't cover was prolactin, which you can guess what it does, makes your breast lactate. And you can see here that a lot of the hormones secreted by the anterior pituitary gland are themselves tropic hormones. If you are in my class, you need to know these 2 from the hypothalamus and these 5 from the anterior pituitary gland. So those you'll need to memorize. Now, before I leave you, I want you to ask yourself, which of these are neurohormones? Only the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary gland secrete neurohormones. So corticotropin-releasing hormone is a neurohormone. Gonadotropin-releasing hormone is a neurohormone. If I were to ask you a true or false question, all hypothalamic hormones are neurohormones, that would be a true statement. They are. What about the posterior pituitary gland? Those are all neurohormones too. Now, what about tropic hormones? Which of these are tropic hormones? Well, everything secreted out of the hypothalamus is a tropic hormone. And many of the hormones secreted from the anterior pituitary gland are also tropic hormones, including corticotropin and thyroid-stimulating hormone. In a follow-up lecture on reproductive endocrinology, you're going to see that luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone are actually also tropic hormones because they control the secretion of estrogen and to a lesser degree progesterone. Now, in a previous lecture, we talked about chemical classes of hormones. So let me ask you this, what chemical class are these hormones? And you might be tempted to say, well, it varies. It does not. These are all peptide hormones, even thyroid-stimulating hormone. Thyroid hormones are going to be amine hormones, but thyroid-stimulating hormone is a peptide hormone. That concludes this lecture. In our follow-up lecture, we're going to expand on our understanding of the hypothalamic-pituitary axis by looking more specifically at cortisol. I'll see you then.